what I'm going to do tonight, where I'm heading to, is to understand how whistleblowers work, but most significantly, when a whistleblower challenges real power, real political power, economic power. There are people who may whistleblow maybe something moderate or something less significant in a democracy, in a robust democracy. And over the years, government and corporations may be able to accommodate that. But history has shown over the last 100+ years, to the Snowden case, that any whistleblower who steps forward to expose the government or a corporation of egregious, unlawful or criminal conduct, there's an enormous conflict of interest. The government, the corporation, they're deeply entrenched, and they dig in their heels, and they will make a move in an authoritarian or totalitarian manner against the whistleblower. The whistleblower, on the other hand, makes a decision of conscience to challenge that real power in the public interest. The public's being threatened, or they're being harmed and they're not aware of it. So that's where I'm going to head to. But I'm going to use the example of Snowden, the refugees who sheltered him, who were all my clients at the time, and myself. And what I want to say is what's happened to these three groups of people is what is to be expected when a whistleblower steps forward and challenges real power. So, some of you may not know the original story, but Snowden was working for a contractor for the NSA. Snowden became aware he was working in the PRISM program, and the NSA, the US government, was spying on every single country in the world. Now, the USA is part of or leading the Five Eyes group, which is the US, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And they were collecting data on everybody. If you had a cell phone or a computer, your data was being vacuumed, and it was being stored in storage facilities in the United States. With Snowden's revelations, it was discovered that there were actually data collection and storage facilities in New Zealand. So what was happening was, without legal justification, there was this global electronic mass surveillance collecting everyone's data, and no justification for that. So Snowden flew to Hong Kong, met with Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian, Laura Poitras, documentary filmmaker, and he made his disclosures. June the 9th in North America, June the 10th in Hong Kong, he showed himself. Greenwald had published 2 articles where the PRISM program was exposed, but Snowden made a decision that he didn't want to do this anonymously, he wanted to show himself. And to make sure that people understood this was legitimate. And I received a call on the 10th of June, Hong Kong time, 2013. And at that time, I had to gain access to Mr. Snowden as soon as possible, because he made a decision of conscience, and the legal test for whistleblowing is there's a public interest to conceal or not disclose information core or deep inside an organization. But there's also a competing public interest to disclose in the public because there's harm or a threat of harm to the public. And in Snowden's case, it's clear that the balance weighed heavily in favor of disclosure. So, and with a lot of my clients who are facing potential criminal prosecution, usually they're emotionally compromised because they realize that the enormous power, machinery, and mechanisms of government will bear down on that individual. So on that Monday morning, June 10th, 2013, I gained access to Snowden as soon as I could, and various hotels were being swarmed by the media. And behind the media, it was necessary and implied that the US government and other governments were there following the media, because they would find Snowden first, and then governments could find him. Why was this important? Because Hong Kong has had a history of extraordinary rendition, assisting the US and UK governments to extraordinarily rendition individuals. The Sami al-Saadi case, Libyan national, his wife, 3 children, were detained in 2004 at the Hong Kong International Airport. They were denied access to the UNHCR, they were denied access to any lawyer, they were denied all their due process rights. And the Hong Kong government said to the UK and US, put them on your nice rendition flight and take them away, which the US and UK did. Brought them to Libya and tortured this man, imprisoned them all, including the children. So that's something that's of judicial notice. You can look online and you can learn about that case. So my biggest concern for Snowden was twofold. We need to get you to the UNHCR to raise your refugee claim. Hong Kong doesn't recognize refugees or asylum seekers. They say they don't exist. If you say the word asylum seeker, they say illegal immigrant. You say it again, they say criminal. There's no such thing as a refugee or asylum seeker. But the UNHCR in Hong Kong is a separate jurisdiction. But the Hong Kong government is compelled to screen people who claim protection under the Convention Against Torture. And in 2013, a Court of Final Appeal judgment imposed an obligation on the Hong Kong government that any UNHCR recognized refugee has to be screened by the Hong Kong government before that person is removed. For example, they lose their case with the UNHCR. So that was Mr. Snowden's first line of protection. So I brought him to the UNHCR that morning, and I calculated that the press wouldn't be thinking that far ahead. And my objective was to stay 1 or 2 steps ahead of everyone, the press, the government, foreign governments. And after attending at the UNHCR, I realized Snowden has to be taken off the radar, which I did. But where do you put him? And I had dozens of other refugee asylum-seeking clients in Hong Kong. Snowden was a refugee asylum claimant, so he fell into the same social group. So I thought, I'll place him with my refugee clients. And Hong Kong's asylum-seeking community is heavily discriminated against based on their race, ethnicity, nationality, language, and they're so marginalized that they're basically ignored by society. And I thought, I'll place Mr. Snowden with this community. No one would ever imagine an American with some tertiary education, who's an extremely bright young man who worked for the NSA and CIA, would be living with ethnic minority refugees in Hong Kong. So I placed him with 3 families over a couple weeks in the most populated areas of Hong Kong. No one would ever look or expect him to be in the most densely populated areas of Hong Kong. I would not expect him to be with the refugee community. So the US made an extradition request to the Hong Kong government, and on the weekend, it would be the 22nd, 23rd of June, the Department of Justice in Hong Kong was looking at the requests, and there were a few defects. Now, I was not aware of any of this at the time. There were some communications with the Hong Kong government whether Snowden could leave or not without being grabbed. My biggest concern was the US could make a preliminary request to have him arrested pending perfection of the extradition request. So a decision was made, let's go to the airport, let's see if we can get you on a flight. His flight was destined for Ecuador, but it had to go through Russia. Okay. A lot of people say, well, Snowden fled to Russia. No, he didn't. He didn't have a visa. He had no right to enter into Russian territory. It's just proper territory. He could transit through, and he got stuck. Subsequently, it was discovered that the US government, and this is an example of too many chefs in the kitchen, the US had requested the extradition of Edward James Snowden. I don't know Edward James Snowden, never met the man. And the Hong Kong government didn't know who he was because there was no record of Edward James Snowden entering Hong Kong, because Mr. Snowden's name is Edward Joseph Snowden. And the US government, there was this significant defect. If they arrested an Edward James Snowden and it was the wrong person, the Hong Kong government would be liable for unlawful detention and constitutional rights violations and possibly a significant amount of money and embarrassment. So the second thing was the Hong Kong government had indicated publicly that they thought Mr. Snowden should leave the jurisdiction. And it's understood that Beijing really didn't want to be in the middle of this mess. So Snowden flew to and got stuck in Moscow. He was given an asylum visa, then permanent residency, a business visa, and then applied for permanent residency in 2017. That was granted. And recently he was granted Russian citizenship. His wife has Russian citizenship and his 2 children were born in Russia. So that's where Mr. Snowden is today. And so that is the story. Now, the people who sheltered Mr. Snowden, the first family on the left is Sapun Kalapatha, his wife beside him, and his wife is holding a little boy named Dinath, and the little girl standing in front of the woman is Setemdi. That's one family. Second family is Vanessa and her daughter, Kiana. And the last person on the on your right, Ajit Pushpakumara, a former soldier in the Sri Lankan army. All of these people all the adults are from Sri Lanka except Vanessa. Vanessa's from the Philippines. The 3 children were born in Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong government took a view that they're stateless. They have no nationality and were not granted any citizenship or nationality in Hong Kong. So they had nowhere to go. They had no rights under Hong Kong law. None of them were allowed to work. If you work in Hong Kong and are caught, even voluntary work, you're looking at 2 years prison. The Hong Kong judiciary considers it a very serious crime to work when you're impoverished and you're an asylum seeker. You could traffic in certain drugs and you'd get 6 months. But if you work in Hong Kong and you're an asylum seeker, 22.5 months after trial and being found guilty. In 2016, Oliver Stone brought out a film called Snowden. Now, before I get there, I just want to go quickly through the law, refugee law. And the key word here is no one is to be expelled or returned or refouled where their life or freedom would be threatened. And that means loss of extrajudicial killing or a threat of that, losing your liberty, detention. But in between that is any serious harm. And the grounds for a well-founded fear of persecution are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and also social group. Now, social groups like a catch-all, and it's evolving. So for example, Vanessa, her fundamental claim was a well-founded fear of persecution based on gender persecution. The soldier, his main ground, original ground in Sri Lanka, was a decision of conscience to desert the military. So these are categories. The other clients, political opinion for Sapun. And the test for a social group. Now, there was a second layer of refugee claims by the Snowden refugees, is that the group has a common characteristic, and it's inherent to who they are, it's unchangeable. But even if it is changeable, that person should not be compelled to change that. And that was, they all made a decision of conscience, a human rights decision, fundamental to their conscience, to shield and protect Mr. Snowden. These are the guidelines of the UNHCR. Okay. So these refugees who sheltered Snowden all formed this social group. And the only other aspect, and this is under the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 31 of the Refugee Convention, any asylum seeker can cross any border legally or illegally if they have a well-founded fear of persecution, or under the Torture Convention, or under the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, if they're going to suffer, or there's a threat of torture or ill treatment. Hong Kong doesn't respect that. Every asylum seeker who comes into Hong Kong, you cannot raise an asylum claim unless you commit a crime. Enter illegally, overstay your visa, come in with a fake passport, or just commit any offense. So all of the clients were given recognizance papers as if they were criminals, including the children. The children are treated as if they were criminals. Now, of course, we did everything to shelter the children from that reality. And the other thing that the Hong Kong government did to these clients, and they did more so when the Snowden film came out, because up until September 2016, the world didn't know that Snowden was saved by these courageous people. But what the Hong Kong government does is they don't allow the refugees to work, they don't allow them to go to school. The children may be allowed to go to school, but it's not a right. They don't have enough money to meet their basic needs to survive. So a lot of them are put in a horrific situation where they don't have enough rent or money for utilities. And what that does is it starts to erode, it degrades them and erodes their psychological integrity. And the Hong Kong government strategy is that if we demean and degrade these refugees to the point that they are either going to take their own lives and commit suicide or resign themselves to a death in Hong Kong, or they roll the dice and they say, we're going to go back to our home country. At least I'll be able to see my family, or at least try before I'm tortured again or persecuted. So this is the Hong Kong government strategy. It's the doctrine of constructive refoulement, meaning they don't directly take your rights away. They don't directly remove you from Hong Kong. They let you decide by dehumanizing you until you break. Now, the two things I'd like to do is just to mention that when Snowden was in Hong Kong, it was only for a short period of time, and he was at risk of persecution by the US government and extraordinary rendition. And he was with the clients for about 2 weeks as a refugee claimant. In Russia, he was at risk of being removed by the Russian authorities, but that fortunately worked out positively for him. But for the refugees who sheltered Snowden, they were persecuted, ill-treated, tortured, and threatened with extrajudicial killing. They arrived in Hong Kong, and they were ill-treated, being subjected to cruel and inhuman degrading treatment and punishment. All of them were arrested, all of them were imprisoned, just for entering into Hong Kong for refuge. There were violations of their liberty and security of person in particular, but there was the threat of loss of their lives. They were at constant threat of being detained at the Castle Peak Immigration Center and removed or deported to their home countries. They were denied their basic needs, and they lived in abject poverty, and their lives were at risk. There was an attempt at extraordinary rendition by the Sri Lankan government. After the Snowden film, Hong Kong government allowed the Sri Lankan CID to enter Hong Kong and to hunt down my clients. Fortunately, the refugee community is very close, very, very close, and I was informed immediately that the Sri Lankan police are in Hong Kong looking for the clients. So we put everyone underground in Hong Kong. Now, I've asked the Hong Kong government, could you please confirm who these officers are, because the Chinese embassy in Colombo must obtain their names, photos, and who their employers are, which would be the Sri Lankan police. The Hong Kong government has failed to reply, and I've asked that since 2017. And at no time have they ever denied the Sri Lankan police were in Hong Kong. And there was persecution committed by the Hong Kong authorities. The police, immigration, and social welfare department questioning my clients about Snowden when it was none of their business, and none of the clients would violate confidentiality. And the social welfare department decided to strip, in particular, Vanessa and Kiana, to strip her of all humanitarian support and education for Kiana. So steps were taken by myself to make sure the little girl did have education, and it was through my own contacts in a private school. But it was a terrible time. And the 3 children are stateless. So I just wanted to put this up here that these clients, the soldier arrived in Hong Kong in 2003. The others arrived between 2003 and 2007. Almost a decade and a half to 2 decades, they've suffered this. Mr. Snowden suffered for 2 weeks. They suffered for more than a decade, decade and a half. All of them stepped forward when I brought Mr. Snowden to stay with them. All of them, without reservation, stepped forward and said, we want to help him. When they understood the magnitude of the case, they stepped back for a second, and then they were resolved to help Mr. Snowden. These clients are extraordinary. They did the extraordinary. Present day, Mr. Snowden has survived, and to some extent, he's thrived. The rest of them, they've been persecuted, they're destitute, deprived of educational, social, and economic opportunities. And today, they are living at or near the poverty line or below the poverty line, lacking public, moral, and financial support, and no opportunities for the adults to advance themselves through education. They've been left behind. So I'm mentioning this today, that the powers that be have ensured all of these things have happened. And for Mr. Snowden himself, he would like to be back home in the US, but he is where he is, and he has to move forward and make a life where he is. Laura Poitras, these are a few quotes from some people who have spoken about the Snowden refugees and how they've suffered and how they risked their own freedom to protect Ed. Oliver Stone called for Canada to bring in the refugees. Edward Snowden himself recognized that if it hadn't been for them, where would he be today? We know where he would be today. He'd be in a supermax, or he wouldn't be living anymore. And Daniel Ellsberg was kind enough to make a public statement as well. And Mr. Ellsberg understood himself as a whistleblower, how they risked their own fundamental rights and the courage it took to help Mr. Snowden. I'm going to talk about myself so you understand what the Hong Kong government has done. But basically, from 2013 onward, the Hong Kong government used various means, the machinery they have, to put pressure on me. And the police arrested most of my clients without legal representation, and in some cases without an interpreter, asking them to make false allegations against me to have me criminally prosecuted. And the police, in fact, asked the clients to lie, to say that I made up the story myself about the Sri Lankan police arriving in Hong Kong. All the clients refused. Why did they refuse? Because the refugees discovered this. I was in Germany at the time. I knew nothing. The Canadian government and LWVC, as Lawyers Without Borders Canada, advised and assisted me to leave Hong Kong. And on 30th of November 2017, they escorted me onto a flight out of Hong Kong to leave forever. I will never go back. My life, my liberty, my security were all at risk. The legal aid department, the duty law service didn't pay my fees, or they paid only a fraction. The legal aid department still hasn't paid me my fees, my full fees since 2013. I was struck off all legal aid panels. I'd done nothing wrong. After the Snowden film came out, they fast-tracked the Snowden refugee cases, and then they reactivated about 50 plus cases that they had left dormant, and they wanted me to do basically 60 plus cases in 2 to 4 weeks. It was a tactic to basically drown me. And in 2021, the Torture Claim Appeal Board barred me from acting for the soldier because they said I wasn't physically in Hong Kong, and they demanded I fly to Hong Kong. My view is there may be other reasons why they wanted me to fly to Hong Kong, and that probably would have put me into police custody upon arrival. I've mentioned this already. The Hong Kong bar, as a self-governing entity, behaved no differently than any government. And they acted in an authoritarian way. At 2017 Bar Association at AGM, they attacked me based on my race, my nationality. They attacked me attributing Snowden's opinions as being my own as well, which should never be done. There's a duty to the client's cause, but it doesn't mean I have to agree with the client's cause. I may agree or disagree. But the bar was furious. They made open complaints against me and did not use formal channels where confidentiality and privilege exists. Okay. And they did this behind my back. Fortunately, one barrister stepped forward and he told me that they were coming for you. And he pointed out that I had done nothing wrong. Lawyers Without Borders Canada has opined I've done nothing wrong. Jeffrey Robertson, QC, who was advising me for a period of time, also advised me I'd done nothing wrong. Not one complaint has been made against me by any individual, okay, who was working with me or in my own inner circle. Why do I mention that? Because shortly after that, the bar launched an anonymous complaint against me, stating that I endangered the Snowden refugees' lives. I exploited them to make money, despite doing all of this pro bono. They said I was doing all of this to drum up lots of money for myself. The basis of the complaint was all anonymous and no evidence. I have asked for full relevant disclosure since 2017. And in 6 years, there's been no disclosure. The Hong Kong bar attached questions where they were asking all about Snowden and the refugees, and they were asking me to violate my most fundamental duty as a barrister, the duty of confidentiality. And they said, if you don't breach this duty of confidentiality and breach client privilege, we will prosecute you for failing to do so. This was a violation of my right to freedom of expression. Freedom of expression has three fundamental aspects. My right to communicate what I want to communicate. And it has to be something that is meaningful, okay? Number two, the public and journalists have a right to receive information. That's a fundamental right of freedom of expression. There is also the right not to be compelled to violate confidentiality and privilege. And that is compelled speech. No one can be compelled to speak and to betray, particularly somebody in my position. So the Hong Kong bar did all of this. And they did not disclose these underlying complaints. I had asked for these underlying complaints and they hid them from me. Paul Lam, senior counsel, bar chairman, had received these. He was in the Standing Committee on Discipline, and he had these in 2016 and hid them from me. Robert Pang, senior counsel, did the same thing. The bar prosecutors did the same thing. And if you can see there, they say that I've put my clients in danger. They'll never be resettled in a third country. That it was disgraceful for me to meet my client. Why is it disgraceful for me to meet my client? He's a client. I do criminal work. And I'm not allowed to visit my client because he's wanted by Interpol. And they felt this was all damaging to the Hong Kong bar. Now what's interesting is with whistleblowers, the whistleblower usually comes within this closed circle of secrecy, deep inside of an organization, where they have access to information. All of this came, and if you go back here, look at the very bottom. large group of exasperated barristers. 2 complaints to the chairman and honorary secretary. So was it 2 barristers or was it 1,500? They were investigating me. Those investigating me, were they signatories to this? I was prosecuted in a bar disciplinary tribunal, and I am right now, to this day. This is dragged on for 6 years. Are the adjudicators signatories to this? The prosecutor, is he a signatory to this? None of the barristers who have investigated made a decision to prosecute. The barrister who chose the panel to judge me, adjudicate, the prosecutor himself, none of them can be excluded from these 2 large groups. And the Hong Kong bar, Lawyers Without Borders asked for full disclosure for the case, and the Hong Kong bar wrote back saying, well, the anonymous complaints, we have to protect them. In black and white writing, that any complainant, their reputation needs to be protected, and it's all privileged and confidential. And I don't understand how you could attach any right of privilege or confidentiality to anonymous complainants. Now, what the bar was doing is they were demanding that I violate client privilege and confidentiality. At the same time, they wouldn't disclose anything to me. So those in power at the bar sought that information and refused to make any disclosure. Mr. Snowden said the same thing in Citizen 4, in the hands of a system whose reach is unlimited but whose safeguards are not. The NSA were vacuuming up all of our data, keeping it secret, and not telling anyone what they were using it for and how they had used it. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Paul Lam, Senior Counsel. He is the man who had the anonymous complaints in his hands. He became bar chairman. He prosecuted me. He brought complaints against me. And in 2022, he was rewarded and appointed Secretary for Justice, or the Minister for Justice in Hong Kong. And he's responsible for implementing the new national security law. The late John Cameron, QC from Nova Scotia, he asks, does this remind you of the Star Chamber? Complainants and adjudicators protected from public accountability in a professional body engaged to protect the public. That is the higher calling of the bar. And Cameron also stated that if he were in charge of the bar, he'd throw the complaints into the garbage. Manfred Noack, my professor who taught me refugee and torture law, opined that there was enormous pressure from the outside. I'd like to go back to Paul Lam. This was the decision maker to prosecute me in 2017. It was under his role as bar chair that these complaints were brought against me. And the threats that if I don't betray client confidentiality and privilege, I would be prosecuted. Oliver Stone spoke about how it was outrageous how he was treated. Go back. Now I'm going to jump to the new national security law. It's ambiguous, wide. Beijing imposed this and legislated this into the basic law. And no right to a jury, no presumption of bail. It's so ambiguous, anybody could be caught and prosecuted. A number of countries suspended treaties with Hong Kong because within the new national security law, Hong Kong can rendition anyone into mainland China. So it was a backdoor extradition treaty with mainland China. And I'll just quickly mention, because I have limited time now, that Justice Spiegelman of Australia resigned from the Court of Final Appeal, non-permanent judge, in 2020. Lord Reid, UK Supreme Court President, and Lord Patrick Hodge, they resigned earlier this year because of the new national security law. Hong Kong's press rankings went from 18th in 2002 to 2022. Hong Kong's press has been decimated. And China threatened Canada not to interfere in China's internal matters, even though China is a signatory to the Refugee Convention and understands Canada is obligated to screen under that convention. These are people who have fled over the last few years. I'll quickly mention these are the human rights lawyers who fled over the last few years. And there's either to Canada or the UK. Paul Harris was the former bar chairman whose last term ended in January this year, and he was threatened by the police that he be charged in the new national security law. Michael Vidler as well. Robertson, for my disciplinary proceedings, I asked that Robertson be admitted to the Hong Kong bar. The High Court said no, and they also ordered that Robertson is not allowed to advise me at all. So now I'm unrepresented and facing the Hong Kong bar for not answering the anonymous complaints. Now, is any of this true? Were my clients not able to be resettled? And did I exploit my clients? And I just want to show you one video, which will answer that question.
To be hunted, to be chased, to be retaliated against. And they smile at me. You know, they open their home games very small. They're living in very difficult conditions, you know, in incredible poverty. And they shared everything they had.
We are, though, very concerned about the other families that are left behind. And we would like to see Trudeau and Mr. Trudeau's government take necessary steps to decide the cases now.
So the first family made it March 2019 into Canada. I had advised them, and refugee claims were brought into Canada. And very quickly, I met Vanessa. I hadn't seen her in a couple of years because I was in exile, and I met her at Toronto Pearson International Airport. The second family came in September 2021. So I think the Hong Kong bar got it wrong. And the Hong Kong bar never stood in support of them and never stood in support of myself. This is the last man standing in Hong Kong, and the Canadian government has dragged their feet for this poor man. And he's all alone in Hong Kong. These are just a few pictures. Vanessa needs help. She's in Montreal. She lives in poverty today. There's no support for her. HelpVanessa.com was set up a few years ago. In the middle of COVID, the previous sponsor abandoned her. But we raised $55,000. Who did that? Friends of mine in the healthcare industry. The son of a refugee family from Vietnam, who's currently a pharmacist, and he's also doing his JD in BCL at McGill University Law School right now. And they suffered through COVID. So I'm going to have to do this very quickly, but for whistleblowers that challenge state power or real political or corporate power, you will be destroyed. The corporation or government will go into totalitarian, authoritarian mode because their interests, whether it's political, national security, or perceived national security, or economic, will trump the public interest. And that has been the same thing over the last century. Okay. Now, I've just given you an example. Snowden's isolated in Russia. You've seen how governments have treated these refugees who sheltered him, and how I've been treated. This is normal. This is what happens. Snowden was a real whistleblower. And this is what happens. So I've gone through all of this in the beginning, but organizations in the state they are not amenable to having individuals with real integrity in their organization. So Snowden's time is over. Snowden did his job, and it's over. Daniel Ellsberg did the same thing. And it's my view what needs to happen is individuals need to continue stepping forward to whistleblow. When it comes to the most egregious conduct of any government or state or organization, what can be done? Because there is an enormous conflict of interest. The politicians and those in government corporations, they're not going to throw away their lives, even though they acted unlawfully, illegally, criminally. And the whistleblower is an easy target. And the whistleblower ends because they've used up their status and power. There's no access to information once they've done their job. And usually the whistleblower never reaches their goal. But to some extent they do. And UN Special Rapporteur Martin Scheinin has pointed out that whistleblowers need to be protected, as do journalists. Most whistleblowing that is involved, the extreme conduct of the state, involves the media, because internally the organization will not accept that, and they will seek to stifle, silence that individual, or destroy them. I've put this up. This family needs help, and at every presentation I ask, please make donations. helpkiana.com, helpvanessa.com. It's nonprofit. The people who run it, they don't take, there's no salary, there's no money, there's no expenses. So it doesn't matter what the donation amount is. But I'm asking that these courageous people who made sure Snowden survived and are relatively safe today, that they're not forgotten, and they shouldn't be left in the position they're in now. Thank you. If you have any questions.